Welcome back, my friends. After what seems like a long time, PNSO has returned with their first offering after Chinese New Year. Now, this is a dinosaur I was expecting might get a remake in the future, but I wasn't expecting it this soon. This is Lucas the Giganotosaurus, and yes, PNSO did make another Lucas. This is 2.0, and it refreshes that offering with some important anatomical updates, as well as the paint aesthetic that PNSO's adopted since that last. Now, most dinosaur lovers will not be a stranger to Giganotosaurus, even before the Jurassic World Dominion came out. And for those of you who were, at least the name would be somewhat familiar to you. In that case, welcome to the real Giganotosaurus. Giganotosaurus means giant southern lizard, from the Greek gigas, meaning giant, notos, meaning austral or southern, and sauros, meaning lizard. It was one of the dinosaurs seen to potentially dethrone T-Rex for the title of largest theropod ever. I've seen claims of up to 14 meters or 46 feet, but realistic estimates would be between 12 to 13 meters, or 39.3 or 42.6 feet long. At a length of roughly 36 centimeters, or 14.2 inches, this represents an animal length of 12.6 meters, 41.3 feet, so nicely falling into the 1 to 35 range. The color scheme and pattern is at first glance very similar to so many other PNSO's theropods, earth tones and stripes, and potentially boring. However, in-hand inspection always tells a different story. Now in this case, you see in terms of the various shades how complex and layered the paint application is. The way the stripes blend into the body has a subtlety that isn't present in all of PNSO's theropods. Even some details like this underpigment really speaks to me of a real animal. The head has a reddish brown about it, and overall the colours seem to be a nod to the colour scheme of its predecessor. And with that, let's look at the head a bit more closely. The head is a pleasure, as it's probably the best model I have that shows Giganotosaurus as it's now thought to have looked. I talk more about that in the science part of the video, but for now, it's enough to admire the usual detail in the face, with the kind of regional variation in scalation that's business as usual for PNSO by now. The eyes are carefully painted. But the striking thing is the color. Now you realize that most paint applications like to highlight the keratinous structures around the brow. The lacrimal crest and the nasal ridges here are picked out in this kind of dull orange. Then tracking down, we get to the very dark, almost black-brown in the end of the snout. But what's pleasing to me is how this darkness fades into this very vibrant orange, almost with a reddish tint, perhaps a kind of visual signal. There are all kinds of blends in the color, very pleasing. Though the choice of the transition here gives the antorbital fenestra a bit of a shrink-wrapped look. Now here, you do indeed get some shrink wrapping over the infratemporal fenestra. Just look at that color again. And then down the mandible, just look at that exquisite detail down here. And terminating, of course, in that characteristic chin, which I'll touch on in the science part of the video. The mouth articulates. While there are seam lines, I like how the soft tissue here enfolds the sliding portion, hiding it. There are no lips in keeping with PNSO's current beliefs, although the previous Lucas had them. The teeth are quite carefully painted, though with some overruns. And the detail on the tongue, the palate with those choanal openings are par for the course for PNSO. Finally, just a quick view of the dorsal and the ventral. And now the body. The body, thankfully, really is Giganotosaurus as you'd expect from PNSO, and not the fantastical creature from the Jurassic World Dominion movie. I still have no idea how they evolved a hump of spikes by any stretch of the imagination. And here's what I meant about subtlety in colour. Now from the side, you'll notice these stripes, but they're actually very faint and really have that subcutaneous look in the pigmentation. I especially like the pattern here, the way it's done. It's got a kind of depth I see only in more expensive models. You know, the whole thing actually reminds me of the Sinraptor, which I greeted with a big yawn when the release images dropped, but which turned out to have a complexity that I appreciated only when I received it. There are actually stripes in the thigh as well, though they're almost obscured by the dark colour. And of course, you have them down the tail. Now needless to say, transitions from light to dark are smooth and natural. Now just a once-over of the scale detail. Again, you have to hand it to PNSO. They always add such fine scaling, wrinkling, folds, and other lifelike textures to the integument. The arms here are sufficiently small, being characteristically reduced in these Carcharodontosaurids, though not to the extent of the Tyrannosaurids or even worse, the Abelisaurids. The claws are nice and quite sharp, with nice fading of colour. And these very powerful ties, tracking down to the leg, to the toes and claws, the foot pads. Again, notice the excellent detail. Like with all PNSO theropods, it comes with a stand. And while it does stand rather precariously, you really must use the stand because the legs do warp over time. It will be disappointing for some of you that being a museum line piece, you'll definitely pay the price for the box and for all the supplementary material. That said, just an example of some of the artwork in here. Alright, now the science, and we're going to look at the head of Giganotosaurus. Carcharodontosaurids have been frustratingly deficient when it comes to skull preservation. As such, reconstructions often had to borrow from remnants of related genera and then composite it together. Most commonly, they'll use Mapusaurus, Tyranotitan, Carcharodontosaurus, and Acrocanthosaurus. For example, in this skeletal by PaleoNerd01 at DeviantArt, he used the partial skull and jaw of the MUCPV CH1 Giganotosaurus. another undescribed Giganotosaurus, Tyrannothitan, Carcharodontosaurus, and various specimens of Mapusaurus. Spino in Wonderland here used Mapusaurus, Tyrannothitan, Carcharodontosaurus, and Acrocanthosaurus. Enter Miraxis. Miraxis is a Carcharodontosaurid described in 2022, and the exciting thing is it has an almost complete skull. The original paper shows the fossil remains. Now, this is the left side of the skull. This is the right side. And collectively, they can fill in for each other to get this. Or for a clearer view, this skeletal. And I suspect that moving forward, we're going to see a lot of Miraxis in future reconstructions of Giganotosaurus. So, how does our new Giganotosaurus compare? Compared to almost all the previous models that came before, at least the ones that I have, you'll see two major improvements. First, the inferior margin of the skull is generally quite level as we move from the maxilla to the jugal and the quadratojugal. And second, the preorbital area is relatively short. And the fall off here in the premaxilla is rather blunt. Now, if we look at some other models, you'll see the jugal here has often been reconstructed to curve down, and sometimes quite dramatically. You'll see this most exaggerated in the 2007 Carnegie. Then, the 2017 Safari, and even the Eofauna has it. Previous version of Lucas being the least exaggerated of all. However, hanging on to this Lucas, it errs in a second way, namely the very elongate preorbital area, ending in a pointy, almost sharp premaxillary here. Now, this is also seen to an extent in the Safari, the Carnegie, and least so in the Eofauna, which to my eye also deserves credit for having a blunter fall-off here. You'll also see the dramatic jugal in exhibits like the Fernbank Museum of Natural History. Now, what I find puzzling is that looking at some of these reconstructions, the Carcharodontosaurus, the Tyrannothitan, Acrocanthosaurus, you don't see how these could have inspired this dramatic downward deflection. The inferior borders of the jugals seem to be quite level with the maxilla. Now, I know little about theropods. To be honest, I'm not as interested in their anatomy compared to, say, the ceratopsians or the hadrosaurs. So, if one of you theropod experts could explain it to me, I'll be very much obliged to you. I've wondered about this for years. The last thing of interest is the chin. The dentary terminates in this flattened, almost like a beveled edge, and then there's this little dip called the ventral process. Now, this creates the kind of chin which is distinct in Giganotosaurus. In fact, it's so characteristic that even the earliest model I have, this old Carnegie, has it. Now, what's the function of this? Well, the mandible consists largely of two dentaries, and these paired elements are joined by a symphysis. Terry et al. 2005 suggested that the chin was actually an adaptation for resisting tension forces on this symphysis during incisal biting. That means biting using the front teeth or the incisors. He cites the work of Highlander 1984. In that paper, Highlander conducted strain gauge analysis on the mandible of the crab-eating macaque. And out of various loading conditions, only in incisal biting was the peak strain along the symphysis in tension. When this happens, the tendency would be for the inferior borders of the two mandibular corpora to evert from each other, pulling the symphysis apart. Now, Highlander suggested some ways to counter this. The first is to have a simian shelf, which is this thickening in front of the ape mandible. Second is to add a transverse torus, effectively thickening the symphysis. And third, and more relevant to Giganotosaurus, is increase the vertical height of the symphysis by adding bone along the lower border. hence the ventral process in Giganotosaurus. Terry et al. Then suggested that the bite of Giganotosaurus was delivered mainly in the anterior-most part of the jaws. Alright, comparisons. First, some Giganotosauruses I have. I've commented on the scientific accuracy in the science part, so we'll just look at the paint and the sculpt. First, we should look at the earlier iteration of PNSO's Giganotosaurus. Now obviously, the level of detail is much finer in the newer PNSO. But there's something about the way the yellow shows through between the roughness of these scales that lends a kind of brightness to this old model. The new one is a lot finer, and so in terms of absolute realism, if that's your thing, then you'll prefer this. Stylistically, the paint application is different, with the current PNSO more subdued, in line with current aesthetics. But in terms of the color palette, there's a parallel to the old Lucas. Just look at their relative sizes as well. Now one thing I miss badly in museum-lined dinosaurs are the bases they used to have. Now, I like art and illustration, and I get to work with children, so I like the extras of it. But for the majority of people, for about the same weight, the addition of a base will be more value-added and really make the model special. You can certainly see how this looks for the old Lucas. But the price might be a bit more expensive to cover production, but I think that most people would be happy with that. Next is the Eofauna, the standard for many people when it comes to the Giganoto. I've always been disappointed with the lackluster paint apps of such an important favourite. The dappling on the sides here does look nice, but in terms of level of detail and differentiation, for example here in the claws of the hands and the toes, there's just no contest. The detail still is very good in a Eofauna, but with less depth. Look at the size difference. Speaking of paint apps, we have this very pleasing wild safari Giganotosaurus, which was actually my favourite Giganoto up to this point. Now I like the tiger stripe pattern, but it has a rather stenciled look to the paint application. Let's compare their sizes. And finally, some other Carcharodontosaurids. Now here is PNSO's Carcharodontosaurus. You can see how similar they are in terms of aesthetics. It does give you a feel of symmetry, given how closely related they are. Both have that very subdued, almost ethereal look to the paint application. And then here's the PNSO Acrocanthosaurus. Now surely an example of how you can have creative patterns on a theropod that's just so pleasing without going all out garish on it and still maintaining the earth tones. Now last of course is my customary Wilson T-Rex. Just for a size comparison. So that's it for the new PNSO Lucas, the Giganotosaurus. It's really deserving of an update based on our understanding of anatomy and with the skull closer to what it probably looked like. I believe that T-Rex should get an upgrade, and it will be very interesting if they decide to give us lips in addition to the obvious skin texture improvements. and I'm still waiting for a real 1:35 scale Spinosaurus. PNSO has really helped us flesh out the theropods, but I really do hope they look at other clades they haven't done in a while, such as perhaps the ankylosaurs. If they were to give us more theropods, it would be nice to have some that were either less known, such as Teratophonius and Marpusaurus. And of course, I'm sure I'm not the only one remarking about the obvious gap created by having no Eudromaeosaurs. But I like that PNSO is always giving us a surprise to look forward to. And I'll see you in the next video.